Welcome everyone to today's lectures. My name is Joe Redmiles and I'm the MC for the lecture series that the Mothman Festival always has. At this point I'd like to, before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to thank the owners of the theater for very graciously making the venue available to us for this year's festival. And at this point I'd like to introduce Steve Ward, who will be speaking on the topic of high strangeness. Steve was born and raised in the Detroit area. He has college degrees from Wayne State University and New York Regents. Steve has spent 4 years in the Navy on a nuclear sub, and he's a regular attendee at the Mothman Festival and volunteer with some of the activities here. So please welcome Steve Ward, who will talk on high strangeness.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. That is the Phantom Menagerie. And find my glasses here. The first thing I wanted to do is just thank the organizers for making this weekend all about Carolyn Harris, dedicating it to her. This was just to have a couple pictures here. This is her with Chip Coffey. This is back at the 2009. When we were at the Return to Mothman event in a very, very chilly February. And she's here with you-know-who. And she was a great lady. Every time I walked into her diner, it was kind of like walking into Mom's kitchen at home. Carolyn Harris. And now I'd like to recognize another lady. This is that shy and retiring Ashley Wamsley Watts. Okay, she doesn't know I did this. She's been a major force in the, setting up of the Mothman Festival and the museum, especially, all that creativity. But there's another reason I've got her up here. Ashley, you see, has a couple of nicknames for me. One is Steve from Michigan, which kind of makes sense because I'm Steve and I'm from Michigan. The other one's a little more colorful. It's, hey, something went bad here, Brian. Yeah, okay. Okay, there it goes. There goes the high-tech deal. The other nickname is a little more colorful. It's Geezer, as in old geezer, which, well, it's meant affectionately, I'm sure. I'm only about a month away from being eligible for Medicare, so it kind of fits. And as my friends will tell me, I'm getting a little crankier as the days goes by, so that's all well and good. But there's actually a kind of a serious reason I'm mentioning that. Occasionally you're going to hear me as an old-timer and a geezer wax nostalgic a bit for the old days, the way things used to be, or whether we perceived it that way, or whether the manifestations that we study in the paranormal have actually altered somewhat. And this kind of relates to something called, John Keel called the reflective factor, which we'll get into a little bit later. Just to kind of give you a basic overview of where I'm going. We're going to talk about 3 or 4 different high strangeness areas today. These are, one of them is very well known, the others aren't so well known as those kind of hot spots where UFOs, Bigfoot, everything comes together. I'll get to the underlying theme in a moment. I'll also be talking about 3 different researchers, a UFO guy, a Bigfoot researcher, and a Loch Ness researcher, and how they started out as from a very flesh and blood or nuts and bolts perspective and went to something else, something more ethereal, something more paranormal. This is kind of an inside joke here. We've got Bruce Harrington on the left representing the forces of flesh and blood and nuts and bolts. We have Fred Saluga on the right, who represents the forces of the interdimensional. So this is sort of a paranormal smackdown. If you guys have ever seen Fred speak and Bruce in the audience, you know what I'm talking about here. But you do notice that it is actually quite a division in the field. What is going on? What is physical and what is not physical? There's a lot of people that don't believe anything about that. Don't look at the paranormal overtones at all. You see they're shaking hands and smiling. You should have seen what happened 5 minutes later. I actually think that these two different ideas meet at one point and might help us understand what's actually going on. Now, I am not an experiencer. I know a lot of you are. I know a lot of you have come into this realm, the paranormal, because you lived in a haunted house or saw a UFO or had some kind of experience. This is how I got started. Remember the great books of Frank Edwards, those great anthologies? That's where I first learned about the Flatwoods Monster and the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins and so forth. And then in March of 1966, I grew up in the Detroit area, Michigan, and we had, there was some very credible, a wave of credible UFO sightings going on in Michigan, in Hillsdale, Dexter, Ann Arbor. And unfortunately, some of them got labeled swamp gas, and that kind of stuck forever. But the one thing that really kind of foreshadowed what I'd be doing, at least for one aspect of my life, and actually has led me to this podium, was what happened the following November. And that was that November 1966 was the first sighting of the Mothman, the first, actually the big one, that went across the wire services and hit all over the world. Now, John Keel wrote in the Mothman Prophecies that he arrived in Point Pleasant with his black suit and tattered briefcase. My entrance was a little less dramatic. I was in my tattered Levi's and tennis shoes, came down in a green VW, found the Low Hotel late one Sunday night, and then I drove out to the TNT area. This is back in 1977, a year after I'd read the book. Back then you could drive around in the TNT area. And I don't remember much about it, didn't know where I went, but I did find the old power plant. Of course, years later they turned it, they tore it down. But now this gets to my, the underlying theme that I hope is going to bring things together a little bit, because I am going to be all over the place. You recognize these guys, right? Well, the lady is Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who of course spoke here yesterday about winged humanoids in Chicago. My wife and I met Rosemary at the 2006 Mothman Festival. This was about the 29 years after my first visit there. She told us that she was studying reports of shadow people. And the following year, she gave us some of the findings, and it turned out that a significant percentage of those people having those, bedroom invaders, those strange shadow people experiences, they're also classic alien abductees. So what a strange connection that was, and that's what this is going to be about today, are things that seem to connect that shouldn't connect. Actually, I interviewed a couple recently from New Hampshire that because of those kind of questions, those links that Rosemary made, I knew what kind of questions to ask them, and I found out some interesting information. Now, I never liked the Greys, all right? Back in the old days, as a geezer, as an old timer, I can remember we used to have, at least from the 40s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, we had some pretty cool aliens, all right? And the serious point to this is, the Greys really didn't show up in mass until the 80s. Now, there was a few sightings now and then that could have been called Greys, but for the most part, they were just kind of a variety of different types of alien or entity or whatever they were. Some researchers have claimed that the Greys didn't really show up in South America until the 90s. I don't know if I can verify that, but this book by John Keel, which came out before the Mothman Prophecies, is the one that really messed me up. Keel pulls everything together in the paranormal. This is UFO's Operation Trojan Horse. He hypothesized, he actually threw out the extraterrestrial theory by the late 60s. And he hypothesized something he called ultra-terrestrials. And that was a sort of an energy or intelligence that was kind of what he called the cosmic mechanism behind all this. He didn't think the manifestations were that important. He thought that there was something behind all these that would kind of masquerade as UFOs and entities and so forth. And this is a little bit the way I felt when I first read Trojan Horse, because it really kind of messed up my paranormal comfort zone, so to speak. Now, this is simply going to represent the fact that a lot of things are not easily explained. The first area I want to talk about is a lot of people know about the so-called Skinwalker Ranch. This book by Dr. Colin Kelleher and George Knapp, investigative reporter. This was first known as the Sherman Ranch. And then billionaire Robert Bigelow, Bigelow Aerospace, who actually has put his own private platforms up around in orbit. He bought the ranch after a while. He was fascinated by the paranormal and eventually set up a scientific team there. This is located in northeast Utah. Now, the Shermans were ranchers. They were breeders of high-end cattle. Now, day one, and a lot of you, I'm sure, know this story, they were still moving in. This wolf, now there's not supposed to be any wolves there at all. This thing came walking into where they were, and it was huge. It was almost like 4 feet off the ground. It was tame. They were able to pet it. But at one point, it went after one of the cows that was sticking its head through a gate. So Sherman went and grabbed his .357 Magnum and shot it 4 times, and it didn't phase it. And then he went and got his .30-06 and shot it. It didn't kill it. It did phase it. It stopped, looked at him, turned around, and walked off. And then he and his son tracked it for a while. The footprints ended in a swamp, just ended. They didn't sink into it, but that was just gone. Now, they saw, that was the first thing that happened on the ranch, and it was pretty unsettling, but life goes on, so that's what they did. Occasionally they would see these wolves again, and some of the neighbors saw them, so they knew they weren't crazy. And they were calling this, referring to them as dire wolves, which of course are extinct for about 10,000 years. They're just giant wolves that used to exist. But they saw other creatures there. His wife, Ellen, well, one time she was ready to get out of her car, and one of these wolves was nearby. But then she looked off in the distance. There was a strange-looking dog-like creature with a large head and long legs. They saw a variety of UFOs in the area, these giant black triangles. And if you do the research, you find that this area was a hotbed for years. The book, the Utah UFO Display by Frank Salisbury, documents a 3-ring circus of all kinds of variety of strange craft. All kinds of things. This is just a sort of a Reader's Digest version of what happened there. One time, Sherman, this is way before the research team came on board, he looked up in the sky and he could see this sort of like a floating platform or something. He couldn't see it from all angles. As he drove around the ranch, it would kind of disappear. Well, one time, one of these giant black triangles flew out of it as if it was coming through a window from somewhere else. The NIDS teams, the National Institute for Discovery Science that Bigelow set up, he bought the ranch, and in September '66, he set up the team. Now, in the meantime, Sherman had lost a couple of cattle. One of them, you could tell by the footprints that it was running from something. Then all of a sudden, the footprints stopped, and something apparently lifted a 1,000-pound calf up in the air. The NIDS team, this is important. The NIDS team covered over 200 separate paranormal events. Not one of them repeated. Now, how do you conduct a scientific survey when the phenomena is so elusive? And then one day they had just tagged a calf. They went, it was just out of sight, a couple hundred yards away over a ridge. The only thing that alerted them that something was wrong, the dog alerted on something and took off. Now, the dog never came back. They went over the ridge and found, and I'm not going to go into the details, but this thing was attacked by some kind of a predator. It was just horribly attacked. But they didn't hear anything, they didn't see anything. So they couldn't, it was totally inexplicable. The next 2 nights later, the livestock, the animals, the dogs were all alerting on something. Something was going on the ranch. And so Sherman and Dr. Colin Kelleher jumped in his pickup. He was determined not to have something else be lost to some kind of unknown predator. So they got in the pickup truck. This is winter, it's the dead of winter, it's pitch dark, there's no lights out there. They're driving around, the headlights sweep across something. They see a shadow underneath a tree. They pull up and they find it's a lone calf, inexplicably has gone off from the crew. When they look up in the tree, and they can't really see it clearly because of the branches and the darkness, they see 2 yellow orbs, some giant eyes of something watching them. Sherman's a crack shot. He shoots it. He's sure he hits it. It hits the ground and takes off. Off to the left, in the shadows, he sees something else, another animal that appears to be some kind of a dog-like creature. He hits that twice and it takes off. So they go up to the area and examine the area. There's virtually nothing there. There's no blood, there's no footprints except one footprint, round, about 6 inches, with 2 talon-like claws coming off it. So how do you explain this? Now, the point with this is, if you take certain things on the Skinwalker Ranch and you isolate them, you could say, well, this is some kind of alien intervention, ET, right? But if you look at or maybe some kind of, other intelligence from some interdimensional incursion. But if you look at the whole, something else emerges, something a little more disturbing. It's almost, you've heard maybe the trickster idea. It's almost as if an unruly, mischievous child somehow is controlling some of this. There was other paranormal activity, and in the house there was a lot of ghostly type phenomena. Things would go missing and then show up again. They would hear disembodied voices speaking in another language over their heads, as if they were talking about them. Sherman was repairing a fence. I don't know if you've ever seen a post hole digger. They're really heavy and hard to move. He set it down behind him, turned around, and it's gone. At first he thought somebody was playing a prank on him. He found it 2 weeks later up in the branches of a tree. But that's not the weird part. One time, this is before the scientific team was set up, before they came over. And when everything was going crazy and Sherman was at his wit's end, they were driving back to the ranch, he and his wife Ellen, and he said out loud, he said, "Ellen, I hope to God nothing happens to those bulls." He had these prize Angus bulls that he was concerned about half a dozen of them. When he got back, the bulls were not in the pen was locked up, and he's frantic. What the hell could have happened? So he's looking all over, he's trying to find tracks, trying to find some clue. He hears something and it's drawn to this old white trailer that has been unused. He looks inside, all the bulls are crammed in there, alive, but in some kind of stupor. And then he starts pounding on the trailer. They start to wake up, and they, because they're so confined, they kick their way out, knock the walls down, and they're free. Now, when I get to a high strangeness spot in Wales a little bit later, there's another strange case of, I guess you'd call it, displaced livestock. But again, how do you put this in the context of aliens? It could be. Now the first, I've been see a little get a learning curve here. There's your black triangle. That's a Skinwalker Ranch. Now, the first individual I'm going to talk about, Jacques Vallée, he was pretty much known as a UFO guy. I highly recommend his works. He was remember Close Encounters of the Third Kind? There was a character in there who was a Frenchman. That fictional character was a nod to the real Jacques Vallée. He was from France. Let's see here. He was trained in astrophysics, a computer scientist. He came over in the 60s, colleague of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, another big name in the UFO field. His first book was, that I read years ago, called Challenge to Science, fascinating book, covered a UFO wave in France in 53, 54. A lot of landings, these egg-shaped craft, silver-suited humanoids, no grays. But then something happened. He discovered that there was a connection with folklore. He focused primarily on Celtic folklore, but not exclusively. And saw that a lot of the recorded instances in folklore with the fairies, the little people, were very similar to modern day UFO experiences. He cites the work of two authors, Wentz and Kirk. Oh, let me, did I jump over that? Well, I guess I took those guys out. Okay, that's good. They were, in both their books, which were written quite a while ago, they went around and talked to people one-on-one. about their experiences with the little people, with the fairies, much like we do taking, modern day UFO reports. So these were not merely tales told by somebody's uncle handed down generation after generation. These were one-on-one encounters with these elementals. Now, Elias Owen wrote a book called Welsh Folklore. Now, the thing is that, let me give you an example of one of the connections. We have UFO experiences with missing time, right? That's pretty common. Well, the same thing happened with the fairies. People would be abducted by the little people, but instead of having the standard unscheduled medical examination, they'd be whisked away to the underground kingdom or inside a mountain or something like that and spend time with the fairies. They would have the same kind of strange time distortion, very, very similar to modern day UFO experiences. Elias Owen in Welsh Folklore, and quote him here, he says, "It was believed that the fairies, for a little mischief, would carry unsuspecting men from one place to another in mid-air and then leave them to find their way home." Sounds a little bit like a modern day alien abduction. Scandinavian elves had big heads, long arms, and short legs. What does that sound like? They probably had a great paddler too, huh? Now we've all heard of, I'm going to make some connections here. We've all heard of vehicle stoppages with UFOs, so we assume that there's something going on with the propulsion system, electromagnetic forces, or whatever, that is causing this. Well, there are some other strange cases here. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to Gettysburg. Has anybody ever seen what they think is a phantom soldier or a phantom army even? There are several cases that in England recorded where they see these phantom armies appear. They can tell where they're supposed to be from because of the uniforms they're wearing. They will even hear the hoofbeats from horses, they'll hear noises and so forth. This was in November 1960, Northumberland, England. Dorothy Strong is in a taxi. They see this phantom army appear before them. The taxi stalls. The fare meter starts going crazy, and they're feeling like they're being buffered against an invisible field. The army dissipates, goes away, everything comes back to normal. This is something I had to cut here. But that's not really the weird part. Here's the weird part. October 1960, West Virginia National State Forest near Marlinton. A man named W.C. Priestley is trucking down the highway on a two-lane. All of a sudden his car stalls inexplicably, rolls to a stop, he looks up, and he sees one of these guys. He decides to retreat back into the woods. He's able to start the car again. He gets a little ways down the highway, the car starts to sputter and smoke and spark. And one of these guys show up again, or the same guy. So how do we explain a cryptid? Now there are several cases like this, not a lot of them, but there are several cases where cryptids are seen to be involved in vehicle stoppages. Some more connections here. Another thing I find kind of annoying are crop circles. Don't get me wrong, they make great calendars, but all the controversy about crop circles, the claims of, well, I know an individual that's been to England and made them with groups of people. There are people that claim that they've seen them appear all of a sudden in a few moments. There are others that claim that Linda Moulton Howe did some research where some people claimed that while they were out there at night making these things, the light ball phenomenon that you see connected with these showed up as if they were observing what these people were doing, you know. But as a geezer, right, as someone, an old timer that harkens back to a simpler time, back in the 60s we had something called saucer nests. There was a famous one in Delroy, Ohio, and this is quite simply where the craft, the saucer, whatever, lands, leaves the circular area depressed in the ground and takes off. There was another one, famous one, this one is in Queensland, Australia. But it turns out, though, it may not be quite so simple, because as we go back further in time, we find that these have been around a long time, even way before the modern day, what we call the modern day UFO sightings. And there were all kinds of lame attempts to try and explain these. there's the same lame attempts to try and explain Mothman as a sandhill crane. They would come up with some kind of atmospheric phenomena. And if we keep going backwards in time, we find that there's another folklore connection, because the fairy rings, the circular areas of the little people, the elementals we're seeing dancing around, are indistinguishable sometimes from these saucer nests. Also, you'd see the fairy lights, or the orbs, or the UFOs, or whatever context you want to put them in, moving around these lights. But it gets a little weirder. Wentz and Sir Walter Scott, they were collecting stories of encounters with the little people and these fairy rings. There was several of them where mushrooms were supposed to be seen growing around these things. Well, it's a long time ago, hard to really put your finger on that, but they've always associated with mushrooms with leprechauns and the little people, right? Of course, we would never see mushrooms on a modern day UFO landing, right? April 1975, Tikal, Argentina. San Juan newspaper, they found there was an area where they were seeing lights landing off in the distance. They went up there, they found a circle, there were landing marks of some sort, and around the perimeter of the circle were 7 8-inch mushrooms spaced around growing around the perimeter. They found another one earlier in '68. It was actually investigated by the military in Argentina. Present. Ron Moorhead is the second individual I want to talk about. This guy is a Bigfoot researcher. He started in the early '70s in the Sierra Nevadas in California. He's the one that has anybody ever heard the Sierra Sounds, those great Bigfoot recordings, right? Well, they were authenticated by Scott Nelson, for example, cryptolinguist. They really haven't been debunked. So for years, they had this interaction with Bigfoot. They didn't see them very often, but they got these great recordings. But something happened. Actually, it turns out Ron Moorhead and his partner, Alan Berry, who was a skeptical journalist at first, they recognized I think you've heard stories of some Bigfoots having sort of paranormal overtones, connections. Well, they recognized there was something paranormal about Bigfoot very early on, but they kept that very close to the vest because they did not want, it was hard enough to get people to accept the existence of Bigfoot without the weird stuff. But in this book, if you see some of his conclusions, he says that he believes, Ron Moorhead, this is the guy that started out as a flesh and blood researcher, that they're telepathic, they have their own language, can change their frequency to blend into surroundings. And there's some very interesting connections with the missing 411 books by David Paulides, which I won't have time to get into. That they are interdimensional, so they can change from mass to energy and back again. Very, very strange for someone that came from that original perspective to say. And keeping on with that theme, this lady, if you're a Bigfoot researcher, you'll probably recognize her, Autumn Williams. She grew up in Ording, Washington, between about the ages of 3 to 6, where a lot of strange activity took place. I think when she was in her 20s, she asked her mother one day, she said, "Mom, were there any strange animals when we were growing up in Washington?" So Sally Shepard Wolford, her mother, wrote this book to tell Autumn all the things that happened there. Early on, she and Autumn were out when Autumn was only about 4. They were gathering wood. They looked up and saw a 7-foot Bigfoot and one about half the size. So they had several sightings. But things get very strange. Their neighbor, Yodi, and her daughter, Emily. Well, first of all, Sally would hear these things moving around at night. Her husband, John, didn't want to have anything to do with it. He just completely ignored it. But she'd hear them at night, moving around, knocking over trash cans, moving through the woods and so forth. And she would hear what she called this rapid-fire Chinese speech, which is very similar to what Ron Moorhead gathered on those tapes. And in fact, Ron Moorhead at that very time was out there making those recordings in the Sierra Nevadas. Sally and the others sometimes they saw the Bigfoots actually disappear before their eyes. Some of them seemed to give off a slight glow. There were classic UFO reports. There were orange orbs that followed the cars. At one point, they could hear this machinery. There was something going on, like it was going on underground. They're right near the Carbon River, so I don't know how there could be a facility under there. But they could, a factory. You can feel the heat, smell, the noises and so forth. It was just like they were out in the middle of nowhere, but it was almost like there was some kind of a complex hidden somewhere that they were getting the reverberations from. And it gets weirder. They investigated there was a situation where back in 1959 there was an alleged crash of a C-118. A collision with something, and the rumor was that it was a UFO. They went to investigate that. The local newspaper that would have covered that, those particular days that it would have reported on that were missing. They also investigated a meteor strike that happened in the early 50s, and around this time, they started being visited by classic Men in Black reports, or characters, like some very strange looking guys. They would come to the door and just ask strange questions. And it was shortly after this that Sally moved away, and it was all completely unresolved, but you had this three-ring circus of Men in Black, UFOs, and Bigfoot in one area. There's a mysterious Man in Black right there. Ted Holliday. He's the third individual I want to talk about. He was a Loch Ness researcher. He was 12 years old when the first, when the modern day sightings came up. The legends go way back, but the road from Foyers to Inverness finally opened up in '33. And that's where he started getting some of these really early photographs and some of the, actually we could call them more modern reports of Nessie. And he saw his first sighting was in 1962. He saw this off in the distance. He didn't see the classic neck or whatever you want to call it. He did see one of the humps, and he estimated that the creature was about 45 feet long. He only had a few brief sightings of the creature over years. But if you go back, the legend of Nessie goes way back. The Kelpie, the water horse, and it's always been associated with being something evil, something negative. Now the cute little plesiosaur you see on postcards with a Scottish tam. After time, Holliday believed that this creature, it was a flesh and blood creature, but he thought it was something more like a big slug from some of the descriptions. When you hear some of the land sightings, this thing actually has come up on land and slithered about like a big slug, not with any feet or anything. This is what, he dug this out, this Telemonstrum gregarium. Unfortunately, it's millions of years extinct, and it wasn't very long, but that was kind of the idea of what he thought this thing probably looked like. And then that's when he wrote The Great Orm of Loch Ness, trying to promote this theory. And I had read this book, and in '73, that's a picture I took there, not a very good one, but that was me standing on the shores of Loch Ness wondering if that thing was going to slither across the road. Now, as time went on, there were several problems with this being a flesh and blood animal. You've heard of the camera malfunctions with UFOs, Bigfoot, haunted houses. The same thing would happen with Nessie. You get ready to take the picture, it'd be gone. They had a couple static cameras on the shores of Loch Ness, creating kind of a triangle, and you can see most of the loch. And where was Nessie? Steaming back and forth in the area where you couldn't see her. There were other problems. Holliday examined many other lakes where these creatures were supposed to exist. There's quite a few of them: Ireland, Sweden, Canada. And they're very similar in description. The problem is that a lot of these lakes are very, very small, have a very small fish population. And so it would be unlikely that a creature that size could exist, much less a colony of them. Also, he found out that this place was a UFO hotspot. That's when he wrote The Dragon and the Disc. He found ancient carvings of the the mandala, the symbol of the disc, purity, in conjunction with the serpent. He thought there was a connection. He thought it was symbolizing in ancient times good and evil. There was a Swedish journalist that got lost in the woods near Foyers. He comes across this craft or something. He thinks it's a submersible and some guys in diver suits. Turns out they're not human, and they get in this thing and it's a spaceship or something, and it takes off. He goes back to Sweden and he's harassed by a man in black. These things seem to have reverberations all over the place. Holiday himself saw several UFOs. He took several UFO reports. And when you bring it up to modern day, Nick Redfern last year came out with a book on Loch Ness, the first guy since Holiday back in the 70s to cover the paranormal aspects of Nessie. And Redfern says that you find modern day UFO reports in the loch of giant frog-like creatures, something like a camel with a tusk, and something like a crocodile with a tusk. So Redfern says either there's a heck of a lot of weird stuff in the loch, or Nessie is still a modern, a modern day shapeshifter. It was Carl Jung that Holiday had read, where Jung was talking about UFOs, a modern myth in the sky, being a kind of a human projection. He thought that Nessie may have also be some kind of a psychic projection. And then it gets really weird here. And this may have nothing to do with the fact that that this is seems to be sort of a high strangeness area. This guy is Dr. Donald Ormond. He thought Nessie was evil and needed to be exorcised. So he went to the four corners of the loch, and including the center of the loch, performed his exorcism. But then some really weird stuff happened. And again, this may have nothing to do with the exorcism. This may have nothing to do with this area. But after he performed the exorcism, they were staying at a house Mrs. Carey owned. That's where they borrowed the boat to go out and do this mumbo jumbo, right? So shortly after that, they're sitting inside. Holiday looks out the window and he sees some kind of a pyramidal smoke-like object moving across and then disappears. Mrs. Carey saw what she thought was a beam of light come through the window and strike him in the forehead. Okay, pretty strange, but kind of meaningless. The next day, Holiday gets up, standing on the shores of Loch Ness. He turns over and looks at the bank, and he sees a man in black standing there. So he walks over after the strange stuff that happened the day before, wondering if he's seeing things clearly. And he gets closer and closer, and it's not really a man in black per se, it's more like a shadow person because there's nothing defined there, it's just kind of humanoid. As he gets closer, his intention is to bump into it to see if it's solid or just some kind of an illusion. And then it disappears. 1 year later, on the very same spot, on the same day, he has a heart attack. Now he survives several years afterwards, and again, this may have nothing to do with anything, but Holiday concluded that this was just a very strange area, and that Nessie was in fact some kind of a paranormal entity. And this is the last high strangeness area I want to talk about. This is Dyfed, Wales. It's spelled D-Y-F-E-D, but fortunately the authors tell us how to pronounce it. There were, this is the Dyfed Enigma. This is again Holiday, the same, the Loch Ness researcher was the co-author of this. And there was a wave of sightings in Dyfed in Pembrokeshire in spring of 1977. Now, these characters were about 7 feet tall, dressed in silver suits. The locals sometimes said they looked kind of like a boiler suit. The trouble is that their arms and legs were usually abnormally long, so probably not some, and there was a case where a couple kids got a hold of some boiler suits in the midst of all this craziness, put them on, walked around town, and scared the hell out of a few people. But they weren't 7 feet tall, and they didn't drive around in flying saucers. This is kind of represents what they looked like, but this was actually a photograph from 1973. There was a humanoid wave in the Midwest in '73, which is very interesting. This was a fake. This was a guy in a fire suit with a few embellishments with aluminum foil. Not the most convincing alien, but kind of represents what they were seeing in Dyfed, Wales in '77. Rose Granville, Havenford Hotel. One night she was buzzed by a UFO coming low over the ground. The next night she's looking out her kitchen window while doing dishes. She sees two of these 7-foot-tall humanoids walking on her property, just walking by. Again, I'm just giving you very, very thumbnail sketches of these areas. 17-year-old Carolyn March. This young lady was awakened one morning with a bright light through her window. She looks out the window, sees the classic egg-shaped craft. She does not see a 7-foot humanoid. She looks on the windowsill and she sees a 3-foot humanoid on the sill. This character had long hair, slanted eyebrows, and a curved nose. Spaceman or leprechaun. The Riverston Farm. Billy and Pauline Coombs, dairy farmers. They had a landing one night. Some craft came down and then took off. The next day, they have just 100 cattle end up, and they're gone. 100 cattle. They find them a half mile away on the Broadmoor farm. Now, the problem is that if somebody was playing a prank, you have to, now the gate is locked up. They've always locked it with a deadbolt. They strapped it up in case the cows bumped against it. The problem is that for somebody to pull a crazy prank like this, hey, Sid, let's get 100 cattle over here and mess with them. It has to go by their bedroom window where they're sleeping. And it could be sound sleepers. But the other problem is the Broadmoor farm, they have to go down a straight line and then go off at a 90-degree angle in order to do this. Shortly thereafter, Billy separates 16 of these cows because they're going to be milking them. He turns around, he goes into the barn, turns on the milking machines, turns back around, and the 16 cows are gone. They're down at the Broadmoor farm again. So, Hugh and Holiday, when they try to, oh, we're not there yet. Oh, that's scary. That's foreshadowing. That's what that is. They made a lot of connections with folklore here, and they're just speculating, obviously, but they found the old tales of the milkmaid who would put her cow and pin her up because she was going to do the milking, and then it was gone. Later on, the little people came to her and said, "You can't put the cow there because it's spoiling our food." Their speculation, their hypothesis is that these elementals, or whatever they are, derive their food, so to speak, from earth energies or ley lines or something like that. And perhaps the proximity of the cattle is interrupting this somehow. Now, I don't know what, still it's like the trickster aspect. What accounts for displaced cattle in any situation? Cyril John, 64, April 1977. Same thing, he's sleeping, he's awakened by a light in the window, sees an egg-shaped craft outside. Next to it is one of these humanoid figures sort of floating next to it. It's not on a platform, it's not on a tether. There's the door, and it's standing right there next to it. So he watches this thing, it slowly drifts over the top of his house, out of sight. Flash backward 10 years, Point Pleasant, West Virginia. A woman John Keel calls Mrs. Kelly. She's going to pick up her children at school. She looks up, egg-shaped silver craft, a humanoid dressed in a silver suit, door open, standing next to the craft without any support. The difference in this entity, or whatever it was, is didn't have a helmet on, it had long flowing hair. Mrs. Kelly looked at this in a religious context, even though there were a lot of UFO sightings going on at the time. By mid-October, things were settling down. Pauline Coombs is coming back to, let's see here. Oh, I'm missing a clear picture. Oh well, that happens. The picture that's missing are these huge stacked rocks that you see on the coast of Wales. They just jut up out of the ocean, like so. she's driving along. Out of the corner of her eye, she sees some kind of a silver object just zoom by. It appears to her that a door kind of opens at the top of one of these giant rocks. It goes in, the door closes. She stops the car to look to see what's going on. And then she sees at the very top a couple of these silver-suited humanoids wandering around doing something, and then they're gone. Okay, now we can do the scary picture here. Okay. I talked to a lady. Now we're making connections here, and really strange connections sometimes. That's what is hopefully linking this together. I talked to a lady, I'm going to call her June. She was an older lady, very sincere. She told me she had a story about her encounters with the men in black. So I asked her some questions to see how much she knew about the literature. And she didn't know that much. Of course, she knew about the movie and so forth, but she hadn't read John Keel or Gray Barker or even Nick Redfern's more recent stuff on the Men in Black. She and her husband had just been married. They were it was the 1960s and near Las Vegas. They were picked up, they were hitchhiking, they were picked up by a black car. She didn't remember the make or model or anything. Inside were two pretty classic MIB types. Black suits, black fedoras. I asked her about the facial features because, as we know, sometimes they're supposed to look pretty strange, but they look pretty normal to her. One thing she said was the dashboard was all lit up, had all kinds of strange things going on, controls and so forth, which is something that shows up in a few of these Men in Black reports. So they took them along their way. They got to the point where they wanted to be let out, and one of them turned and said, we think you should wait a little while before you leave. And then they both fell asleep. After a while, they woke up, and then they got out and went on their way. Now, at all this time, they're not thinking how odd everything is. It's later on they put it together and think, man, was that weird. So they walk to a small motel, and they walk inside, and the proprietor takes one look at them and just about falls over, and he says, my God, it's a good thing you guys didn't get here any earlier. And she said, well, why? And he said, well, there was another couple, and apparently this other couple looked similar to them, not identical, but if a police APB had been put out, they could have been picked up. They had just robbed a store. They had been apprehended, and the danger was gone. But if they had shown up earlier, they may have easily been fingered for something they hadn't done. Now, here's the weird thing. There they are. We know the Men in Black as harassers, UFO silencers, really nasty guys. But here's a magazine that actually deals with, we've all heard stories of angelic intervention. People claim that sometimes an individual or a group of people are in dire straits. A mysterious stranger shows up and helps them out of their difficulty, and then they're gone. So how is it that Men in Black are doing good deeds? When does that happen? These are the only Men in Black that do good deeds that I know of, right here. Now, let's see, time here. Okay. Betty and Barney Hill. Gonna sound like an old timer again. It's really, really good idea, I think, to go back and look at some of the old classic cases. Now, I'm just going to give you a Reader's Digest version of what happened to them, because the aftermath is what is so bizarre. This is a classic UFO abduction, one of the first well-known ones in the early 60s. They were returning from vacation on Route 3. They had a close encounter with a UFO. They actually could see the entities through the window. They had missing time. They went home. They were having all kinds of problems. They eventually underwent regressive hypnosis with Dr. Benjamin Simon, and they uncovered a shared experience, these very credible people, a medical examination. Betty had long conversations with this alien, and it was all recorded on hypnosis. It was covered in mainstream press in that time, the Look magazine. They made a phenomenal made-for-TV movie where James Earl Jones starred as Barney Hill. Very well done. And I need to say that the source for what follows is Dr. Schwartz interviewed Betty Hill. And this is a great resource, Flying Saucer Review, by the way, which you can get on Kindle. And his book has just been republished, Schwartz, where he interviews Betty. A little pricey, but excellent. And then Kathleen Marden, Betty's niece, talks about Betty's journals, and that's what is going to unfold here in a minute, because the abduction was the least strange aspect of the whole thing. The first thing that happened was there was a great deal of poltergeist phenomena, classic haunting stuff that suddenly went on in the house. One really strange thing that happened was Betty lost her earrings during this abduction. One day she comes home, she looks at the kitchen table, there's a pile of leaves on it, and her earrings are there. They were plagued by men in green, okay? What I mean there is, there were several men that would come to the door in green coveralls. They'd come all the time. And they would need to go downstairs and check something. She thought they were the gas meter guys. Well, what was going on that the gas meter guys needed to be there so often? Turns out later the gas meter guys wore blue. One time they picked up the phone and heard something like base intelligence. So they knew they were being monitored. So some of the weird stuff going on was certainly human intervention. Barney Jr. was stationed in Panama. He's standing a late night watch. There's a gentleman all dressed in white that identifies himself as Mr. Geist, Mr. Ghost, proceeds to ask him all kinds of questions about his father and his mother and their experience aboard a flying saucer. And this happens on several successive nights. Betty's family members start having strange phenomena. Check my time here. One night, a group of them are over at somebody's house. A car pulls up in the driveway. They can see, through the window that somebody gets out, lights a cigarette, and they figure, oh, here we go. Another journalist, another wannabe UFO investigator asking the same questions over and over again. They wait, nothing happens. They go outside, check the driveway, no car there, didn't hear it leave. They look across the street, they see a giant ball of light receding across the street and then disappearing behind the neighbor's garage. But that's not the weird part. Robert Holman of NICAP, the National Investigations Committee, Aerial Phenomena, he's the one that originally suggested Barney and Betty Hill seek regressive hypnosis, which worked out very well for them. He had another idea. He said, Betty, why don't you try and contact the aliens again using telepathy, because they had some kind of telepathic communication going on, supposedly, on the craft. So Betty agreed. So, here's the idea. Betty went out on her porch every night at 9 p.m. and sent a message to the aliens. The problem is they couldn't land there because it was too congested. They had to go to, she suggested they go to her parents' place, gives the address mentally, right, half hour away. So they're supposed to land there in this nice, convenient field next door, knock on the door, and they'll get a hold of each other and get together, okay? Now, I'm not sure how well they thought this out. I mean, can you imagine the phone call from her mother? Betty, the aliens are here. You better hurry over. We're running out of things to talk about, and they don't seem partial to my shortbread. That did not happen. But sometime later, she got a call from her father, and her father said, Betty, you better get over here. She did. They told her a story about his cousin's widow. His cousin's widow lives very close by, and she's in her early 70s, and her last name is also Barrett, okay? So one night, she gets a knock on the door, and then a pause, and then a series of knocks. Now, she has no clue what's going on. She looks, sees out the window, there's a bright light coming in. She gets up and looks, and there's a classic flying saucer hovering over her backyard. Not only did she not answer the door, she had no clue as to what they were doing. So Betty goes back to the drawing board. Something weird happened, so maybe they're going to hit pay dirt, right? Now, the thing is, Betty really didn't expect anything was going to come out of this. They were all surprised that they actually had something happen. So she goes, now you can imagine, she goes back and she essentially tells the aliens that you got the wrong place, here's the address. I mean, she could have said, you guys can make it all the way from Zeta Reticuli, but you can't find the right damn house. So time goes by, Her mother hears a knock on the door, and then there's a pause. This is late at night, and then a series of knocks. Now her mother, who apparently agreed to this, is petrified and doesn't move. Finally, she wakes her husband up. He gets up. All of a sudden they hear a loud crash, sounds like an explosion. The house reverberates. They forget all about answering don't aliens float through walls and stuff? They forget about answering the door. They go downstairs to see if the furnace is blowing up or something. Everything's fine. The house is intact. But not only did they not answer the door, they did not get back to sleep that night. So, and can you imagine what would have happened if either lady had answered that door? Would a full-fledged Betty and Barney Hill alien been standing there? Would it have been something more like the rappings or knockings you experience in a poltergeist outbreak or haunted house? But there went what was my perfect ET case. This is the thing I always went back to in the midst of all that weirdness we just talked about. This was the perfect case, but not really anymore. Still possibly aliens, but how do we explain all this strange aftermath? So, you say, okay, Steve, why have you led us on this merry chase? We've been talking about window areas, sort of a phantom menagerie. In these areas, the lines kind of blur between these different types of phenomena. Was John Keel right? When he talked about these transmogrifications of energy, that the manifestations weren't that important. It was what was behind the energy. Is there a reflective factor where manifestations keep pace with our beliefs and expectations? We start with the strange airships around the turn of the last century. Before that, the ferries, the airships, the silver saucers. There is a connection between past and present. I think that the same source of some of this folklore is identical to some UFO experiences. But there's not one answer. And we do have to deal with this duality, this seemingly physical side and the non-physical. Are we dealing with, some have proposed that maybe some Bigfoots, for example, are real, but there's a counterfeit, like the one Stan Gordon investigated in Pennsylvania in the early 70s. Is there a counterfeit of the real? Is it a reflective factor of human consciousness? But here's the deal. The underlying thing are the connections. Remember I gave the example of Rosemary investigating shadow people and discovering that a significant percentage were also alien abductees. She did not say the right questions to people when they've had these experiences. So what I'm suggesting is this: as we go about our individual research, whether it be specific or general, to, so to speak, listen for that knocking. Because one of you may be the next individual that will uncover one of these unknown links that nobody else has, and we may be a little further along trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Now, a couple quick things and we're out of here. 2003 Mothman Festival, the statue was unveiled. Keel did this incredible, all his interviews were phenomenal. But this one, he said something that just totally floored me. At one point, he says, so many mysteries. People should stop trying to solve mysteries and live their lives. And I thought, spoken by the man who tried to solve some of the most impenetrable mysteries of all time, I wonder what brought him to that. That was a showstopper. And lastly, our good friend Brian Zeller wrote a song called Mothman, What Are You Gonna Do Now? It's a great song that covers all the weirdness in the middle 60s, the UFOs, the Mothman, the Men in Black. It honors Mary Hyre and Linda Scarberry, two ladies that are no longer with us, but were key players during that time. I want to leave you with a line in the chorus, which is kind of a motif for what all of us are doing out there. And the line goes, Keel, go get your flashlight and chase down the Mothman. Well, that's kind of what we're doing, isn't it? Grabbing our flashlights in the dark, in the woods, an old house, an ancient cemetery, maybe even a concrete igloo in the TNT area. and chasing down the unknown. So, in closing, and with all due respect to John Keel, one of the very few times I disagree with him, this is exactly how we're living our lives, solving mysteries. Thank you. Almost every week I'm on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files, radioactive broadcasting. This young lady, Emily Mittermeier, is on occasionally with me, and sometimes she's on solo. And we're going to do a wrap-up of the Mothman Festival recording this Tuesday. Next week I have a special of just me, the best of Steve. So man, if you didn't get enough of me today, you can have more. Thank you. You've been a great audience.